welcome back to the Countering Climate Skepticism podcast, the podcast where we discuss and counter the arguments put forth by climate change skeptics and deniers. If you aren't convinced by climate change, our podcast will help to explain why it really is happening and why it is a big deal. If you are already convinced, we aim to provide you with the facts and evidence to challenge any climate denial arguments you might stumble across. My name is John Rainier and I'm joined by my co-host Mark Prosser. Mark, can you believe it? We have now released 10 episodes.
It's amazing, John. It's absolutely amazing. It's surpassed all my expectations, and largely in part thanks to you. So thanks for being such an amazing co-host.
Oh, thank you, Mark, and thank you for being such a fantastic scientist as well, and thanks for reaching out and getting us started on this. I think we can confidently say we are now the number one podcast about countering climate skepticism, if not the only podcast about countering climate skepticism. Probably because people can't get the words out. So this week we're going to be looking at our long-awaited episode on Jordan Peterson.
Jordan Peterson, yes. Looking forward to this, yes. Well, tell us, what do you know about Jordan Peterson, John?
Well, let's get straight stuck into describing a little bit about him. He's quite a controversial figure. For those people who don't know anything about him, he's a Canadian psychologist, an author and a media commentator. He's often described as conservative and being somebody who has a lot of support from people on the right wing. He has become a bit of a popular figure around some members of the far right as well. He began to receive a lot of widespread attention in the late 2010s for his views on cultural and political issues. He's somebody with 2 degrees in political science and psychology. He's been a researcher and teacher at Harvard University. Now, in his own words, he describes himself as a classic British liberal and a traditionalist. According to an article in The Guardian, he supports universal healthcare, redistribution of wealth towards the poor, and the decriminalisation of drugs. However, on the other side of things, how he's often portrayed, how he often describes himself and what he often says suggests quite a very different view. He suggests that universities are largely responsible for a wave of political correctness that's appeared in North America and Europe. He contends that proper culture and Western civilization are being undermined by postmodernism and neo-Marxism. He critiques political correctness, and particularly over issues such as postmodernism, postmodern feminism, white privilege, cultural appropriation, and, very topical for what we look at on this podcast, environmentalism. One of the areas that he is most popularly known as, or most famously known as, is his views on gender. He's argued that there's an ongoing crisis of masculinity and a backlash against masculinity. He argues that the masculine spirit is under assault, and he's argued that the left characterises the existing societal hierarchies as an oppressive patriarchy, but that people on the left don't want to admit that the current hierarchy might be predicated on competence. Quite a controversial view there, that people are at the top, that men are in positions of power because they're better. He's also said that men without partners are likely to become violent, and that male violence is reduced in societies in which monogamy is a social norm, so that male violence is inherent. He's also attributed the rise of Donald Trump and far-right European politicians to what he says is a negative reaction to a push to feminise men, and saying that if men are pushed too hard to feminise, they will become more and more interested in harsh, fascist political ideology. In 2016, he stated he would not use the preferred gender pronouns of his students. He claims that a bill in Canada that was related to this, the C-16 bill, was a restriction on freedom of speech. And transgender activists have accused Peterson of helping to foster a climate for hate to thrive and of fundamentally mischaracterising the law. So, anything you want to add on Jordan Peterson there, Mark?
I think you've done a pretty good job. Very thorough explanation of what the guy's about. I don't know if you mentioned, he also wrote a book, 12 Rules for Life, which is super best-selling, like millions of copies sold, and has sort of sterling advice in it, like remember to tidy your room and stand up straight. Some of these pieces of advice I still probably need to incorporate in my life, to be honest. But yeah, and also like he's very. I mean, if you go onto his Twitter account nowadays, you'll find he's a prolific tweeter. He tweets. I think there was one day I went on it and I saw there was something like 130 tweets in a day, and that is not atypical for him. Yeah, it's just, and it's
how do you have time to do anything else?
I think this is a good question. You get me to tweet 100 times, I wouldn't be doing anything else. But again, he's very involved in the culture war. You know, like all these. So he's very against the left and left-wing ideas, environmentalism. He sees
while
one of
saying
these.
that he's not right-wing. Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, I think that was more a thing of the past. I'm not sure so much now if he tries to sort of pass himself off as a sort of a neutral figure. I think he maybe embraces it a little bit more nowadays. But yeah, so it's a lot of complaining on his Twitter account. And I think he also had did you mention he was he kind of had a mental health crisis at one point?
No, I've not mentioned that. No.
Okay. Yeah, so he got addicted to benzodiazepines as a result of a mental health problem, and then he ended up getting taken to Russia, where he was put in a medically induced coma, and so he probably almost died during that process. So he's been through the wars.
Yeah, definitely. And so yeah, he's kind of morphed across his career. So although he started off, you know, as a psychologist, and I think for a long period of time, we're still seeing a lot of clients. I believe about 20 clients a week. I think until still very recently, he's kind of morphed into more of a kind of self-help guru type with his fingers in lots of different pies, and that's where today's episode kind of comes in, because so this is based on an episode of the Joe Rogan podcast that he did, episode 1769. If you want to check out the whole version of it, it's the 4-hour 15-minute one, but it's only the first 30 minutes that are him discussing climate change, and that's really the focus of what we're going to be looking at today, because like this is somebody that has a very large platform, somebody who has a lot of followers, and therefore a very large voice, and is able to influence a lot of people. Yet from what we're going to be looking at today, there's a lot of what he says that is not true. There's a lot that he says that is a misinterpretation or a misunderstanding of the true situation, and there's a lot that just needs correcting and clarifying. So that's what we're going to be looking at. So we're going to be going through several different clips. We'll play you some of the clips so you can hear what he says first of all, and then we're going to discuss that. Shall we start with our first one then, Mark?
Let's do it. Have you got it lined up?
Yeah, let's do it. So this first one that we're going to be looking at is him right at the start of the episode talking about what climate is.
There's no such thing as climate, right? Climate and everything are the same word. And that's what bothers me about the climate change types. It's like, this is something that bothers me about it technically. It's like, well, climate is about everything. So, okay, but your models aren't based on everything. Your models are based on a set number of variables. Yeah. So that means you've reduced the variables, which are everything, to that set.
Okay, so that's our first one. Climate is everything. So, I mean, like even for myself, Mark, as a non-scientist, you know, I do have some kind of semblance of an understanding that any kind of scientific experiment, any kind of investigation involves selecting specific variables and then, where possible, inducing control variables. But in stuff even as relatively simple as the human body, when it comes to kind of modelling things, you can't ever have a complete control situation. That doesn't mean that anything that we discover about the human body is bollocks. So, like, there seems to be some real flaws in thinking here. What do you think?
Yeah, certainly that all of what you said is true. Climate is everything. It just struck me as someone who's spent years studying what the climate is, that's just a nonsense. Like, so, I mean, like, for a start, like, climate is the sort of the average over time and the average over space, and this makes it different from the weather. And later on, we'll see that Jordan Peterson doesn't really understand the difference between weather and climate. But I think here he's making a different misunderstanding. So it took me a while, but after listening to this like multiple times, I think when he says climate is everything, what he's referring to, I think, or my best guess at what he's referring to, because he's not very clear in what he's arguing. Like, climate is everything. He's accusing people of being vague when it's him who's being vague himself, you know. What I think he's talking about is the way that certain climate activists will say, in order to sort out climate change, we need to change everything. So I think that's what he's pointing at and criticizing. So and essentially by everything, it means sort of capitalism. So he's got this. So when he's sort of thinking about this, he's sort of being critical of, you know, the sort of the down with capitalism sort of folk on the left, you know, in order to sort of deal with the climate crisis. So you've got climate is everything. But then he goes on immediately then to talk about like climate models. And it's like, hang on a second. On the one hand, you've got climate activists like Extinction Rebellion who are throwing soup at, you know, like pictures in galleries. But then you've also got like sort of climate scientists who are involved in the sort of scientific enterprise to sort of understand how the climate works. You know, they're sort of real scientists. And I guess there's no two categories that perfectly don't overlap.
Yeah.
But climate scientists are very, very different from climate activists.
Yeah.
But
climate change
in his
types,
head,
as he describes them, climate change types. Yeah.
Exactly. Yeah, like, so it must be just one big circle where, like, you know, you take a climate scientist from, like I don't know, Harvard or whatever, and, like, they're exactly the same as an Extinction Rebellion sort of young student, age 20. It's just like, yeah, like there's a bit of a difference between the, you know, the industry of climate science and then, you know, activism. Yeah. So I think, you know, if he understood that difference, a lot of what he's saying might make a bit more sense. But he doesn't.
As we're going to see quite a lot here when we talk about Jordan Peterson in this kind of area, like, you know, it's very common. You know, when I'm teaching geography to year sevens, one of the things that they trip up on quite a bit is the difference between climate and weather and the definitions between the two. And Jordan Peterson is a very intelligent man, but here he is demonstrating year 7 levels of understanding of the difference between climate and weather. And I think this is going to be a recurring theme from what we discussed today, but it's an example of somebody talking about things like they know what they're talking about when they're talking outside of their field of expertise. You know, very confidently sounding like they're an expert, but actually not being one. Yeah. So our next clip then is about the idea that we have to change everything in order to fix this problem.
That's what people who talk about the climate apocalypse claim in some sense. We have to change everything. It's like, everything, eh? Okay, what? And the same with the word environment. That word doesn't mean, it means so much that it actually doesn't mean anything. Like when you say everything, in a sense, that's meaningless, right? Because, well, what are you pointing to? Well, I'm pointing to everything. Well, what's the difference between the environment and everything? There's no difference. What's the difference between climate and everything? Well, there's no difference. So this is a crisis of everything? It's like, no, it's not. Or if it is, well, if it really is, then we're done, because we can't fix everything.
Okay. Thoughts on that one, Mark?
It's more of the same, and it's sort of extremely muddled, you know. And now you know, like the word climate was under fire in the previous one, and now the poor word environment has become, you know, sort of robbed of all meaning. But yeah, like I don't know, there isn't much to really add from my point of view here, but the I just get the sense that, so in what he sort of said at the end, you know, it says we don't have a problem of everything, or if we do, we're screwed because we can't change everything. You sort of get a sense that he he finds the idea that there could be a problem so massive, he's incredulous about it. He can't believe that, we would have such a big problem. If we had, because you're claiming we have such a big problem, that must demonstrate that there isn't a problem. It's a bit funny logic, but yeah, he just...
And this is something that I do notice with Jordan Peterson, because, he very much has a very clear understanding of the scientific method from his psychology background and sociology. But sometimes he takes these real leaps that would be something that you would expect more of somebody from more of an artistic background rather than somebody from a scientific background, that leads to these things that sound very intelligent, but actually when you unpick them, there's a real lack of rigor going on in what he's actually saying. And this idea of just like leaping on individual words, like leaping on the idea of environmentalism, leaping on the idea of the climate. It's almost just like this emotive response to a word rather than actually, well, let's look at the evidence and let's look at what that's actually showing.
Yes, it's kind of a bit ironic because, in other fields he's very sort of like anti-postmodernists, and the way that postmodernists like problematize specific concepts, and like he's busy problematizing words like climate and words like the environment. So he's kind of being very postmodern.
Do you want to explain postmodernism a bit for people as well?
Yeah. I'm trying to think of a good example, but a postmodernist approach might be to. Well, okay, I can do it like this. So I can't give you the best example of of a postmodernist in action, but one thing, if you're arguing with someone who has a postmodernist persuasion, you'll find that you might make a certain sort of point, but then instead of sort of engaging with your point, they take certain words that you're using and they kind of dissect them in order to sort of undermine them. So it means that by the time that they're through with you, they haven't really answered your question, but they've attempted to render the point that you were making obsolete in the first place. So it's a kind of style. And in the same way, Jordan Peterson is the climate. You could say something like the climate is changing, and then he's like, well, what do you mean by climate? Climate is everything. Therefore, it's nothing. Therefore, the thing that you've said, it doesn't make any sense.
Yeah, I mean,
like you haven't got a point.
From my understanding, it's almost like he's critiquing postmodernism by using postmodernist methods.
Probably, yeah. I mean, he wouldn't like that, but I think other people have made that point, certainly, about him.
So the next one that we're going to be looking at is about climate modelling errors.
What they mean specifically is what human beings are doing that's causing the Earth to warm.
Right. But you have to include all these factors in the models to determine that. All these factors. Well, what can you not include? Well, then, by deciding what you don't include, you decide which set of variables are cardinal. And you have to make that decision in some sense before you even generate the models. This is a big problem. There's another problem that bedevils climate modeling too, which is that as you stretch out the models across time, the errors increase radically. And so maybe you can predict out a week or 3 weeks or a month or a year, but the farther out you predict, the more your model's in error. And that's a huge problem when you're trying to model over 100 years, because the errors compound just like interest. And so at some point, it's all error. In fact, it's already the case that even if the climate models are right, the error bars are so wide by 100 years out that we'll never be able to measure the effects of the changes we're making now. We'll never know if the changes we're making, to save the climate actually worked. We can't measure it.
And this one really kind of sits at the heart of the bullshit, really, doesn't it? I mean, like, this is an example of him using his intellectual understanding of scientific method to say something that sounds very convincing, sounds very well thought out, and also is very soundbitey. So little clips of this could do the rounds on the internet of, look, here's some evidence from Jordan Peterson about why all this climate is bullshit. Where is the actual bullshit in what he said there, Mark?
Right, there's an awful lot. Like, I don't know where to start, really. I mean, to start off with, so you were saying, yeah, okay. Right, I'll go through it chronologically. So first of all, he starts off by saying something about models. And he's saying, scientists have to think about, like, what factors they put in their models. And this is a big problem, or he says something like that. And it's like, this is just so elementary and has been part of climate modelling since it began. And so you're saying something that is utterly banal, and that is, but because you're saying it in that fashion, it gives the sort of sense that, hang on, climate scientists haven't thought of this, they haven't. Yeah.
If you were,
it's very frustrating.
If there was any climate scientist sat there right there, they straight away would be, yes, Jordan Peterson, you have very simply spelled out what climate models are, not the problems with them, but what they are, what we already do.
Yes, as if it's something new. So yeah. Anyway, okay. So here, I think you mentioned it before, John, but like Climate Peterson, Jordan Peterson is also, apart from the fact that he's confused between the scientific industry and activism, he also has a bit of a conceptual misunderstanding between weather and climate. So he's sort of saying, because of chaos, you can't, as you run the models forward in time, the errors compound, and so like by the time you're way out into the future, it could be fucking anything.
Basically. So basically, that idea of when you're looking at day-to-day weather, our predictions for weather are very inaccurate because of the chaos inherent in the system.
That's correct, yeah. And so for that reason, we don't have an ability to forecast the weather further than 2 weeks out. So by the time it gets to, 2.5 weeks, 3 weeks, it's could be anything basically. But that's to do with the fact that in weather you're typically predicting, in the south of England on this day in the future what it's going to be. Whereas with climate, you're kind of predicting an average. So when we talk about the climate in 100 years, we're talking about the global average temperature, whether it'll be 2 degrees warmer than the pre-industrial or 3 degrees warmer. And here you're taking a massive average. And so I was thinking about some way to sort of explain this. And so, for example, if I was to ask somebody to predict in the month of July next year, where will an earthquake happen on planet Earth? It's just really, really difficult to do that. However, if you were... Sorry, this is not a perfect example, but it sort of explains how averages are slightly easier to sort of predict. If you were to sort of say, okay, how many earthquakes are we likely to see within the whole year of 2025? We're much more likely to get that right because we're taking sort of an average. So all the small variations. What else? By 100 years out, by the end of by 2100... There are error bars on where we think the climate will be. And it's also interesting to note that these error bars are largely the various reasons why there are these error bars. But first of all, they're not so big that we have absolutely no idea what's going to happen. So if we carry on business as usual, I don't know what the temperature range is. Maybe it's like +3 to +6 or something like that. So that's the difference between pretty awful and absolutely catastrophic. And so that's already enough information to mean that we should have enough motive to sort of cut our carbon emissions and things like that. So there is error. He's not completely wrong there, but it's not to the point where we just have no useful information at all.
His idea that the errors are basically meaning that the results are meaningless isn't the case at all. The errors, even though there are variance in those, are still showing that there is a significant increase in the average, and that average is going to have an impact, and that impact needs to have something done about it.
Exactly. Yeah.
I've got written down here. I mean, like one thing that I think you talked about when we were discussing this previously was the idea of the fact that we can predict some systems that operate in the world, in the universe. For example, Halley's Comet. So we can accurately predict that every 75, 76, 74, whatever number of years it is, that will come around. So even when you've got variables that you cannot control, there are systems and processes that you can accurately predict based on what we've had previously.
Absolutely correct. Yeah, it depends. It depends on what you're modelling, what problem you're modelling, and so the weather is sensitive to the initial conditions. So if you have like when you start your model, if you have a slight error in the decimal place, in one of the variables, then that error will grow and grow and grow. But that's not always the case, depending on the system that you're modelling. So with Halley's Comet, we can probably fairly accurately know where it's going to be in hundreds of years, because in some ways it's a simpler problem. And with things like, climate change, we know that we have it fairly sort of solidly down that the sort of greenhouse gases cause warming, and the relationship between warming and the greenhouse gases. And so, if we keep pumping these out into the atmosphere and they don't get taken down somehow, the temperature is going to rise. And so it's not actually, in a weird way, climate is, there are complications in the system. How is the ocean going to react? How is the land going to react? And also, how are we going to react? Like, are we going to, you could see a future between now and 2100 where we decide to get our act together and really cut carbon emissions and they fall. And then so the temperature won't be as high, or we could, do the complete opposite and just keep on pumping them out. And so it's actually, so we are a big factor in this scheme. And that's part of the reason why you've got sort of the error bars about what the temperature is going to be like. But it's not really to do with the initial conditions. So it's a different problem, like you say.
Because there are elements of the science that can be done in a vacuum, as it were. We do know that what carbon dioxide does in the atmosphere. We also know that the carbon dioxide has increased. We also know what's caused that increase, and we also know what will continue to happen if that increase continues to happen within a degree of tolerance. I think something you also mentioned previously as well, that like the accuracy of the predictions in 100 years' time depends on the question we're asking. So you were telling me previously that we can predict the global system and the global average much better than we can predict individual areas. So it's harder to predict what the climate will be like in Europe, say, for example, in 100 years, than it would be for the global average as a whole.
Yes, exactly. Yeah, thank you for reminding me. That's a very good point. So I guess it comes back to, so if we're taking the climate of the globe and we reduce it down to the climate of Europe, we're sort of taking over a slightly smaller geographical area. And because of that, there are going to be factors which influence Europe that don't affect everywhere else. So because of that, it might become a different problem and a different complexity of problem. But Jordan Peterson, like, he's seen the weather. He knows you can't predict the weather in 3 weeks. Therefore, how are you going to predict the weather in 100 years? And it's like, it's not the weather, dude.
It's about as he's about as much an expert in this as just your average person writing comments on a YouTube video. Like, he has no experience to be able to be arguing these claims, but unfortunately has a large enough platform of people who listen and believe what he says.
Yeah, it's unfortunate, isn't it? Because this is where their knowledge is going to come from. They're going to be like, Jordan Peterson's skeptical, I'm skeptical, because he sounds like he knows what he's talking about. And it's and he isn't. He doesn't, rather. So depending on the problem that you're modelling, you don't have to include everything. You need to include what's relevant to the problem. And necessarily that's going to involve a simplification of the number of variables. But provided, what you've included in there will give you the answer you seek, that's fine. Like to model Halley's Comet, you don't need to sort of have who's going to be the next president of the United States in there, obviously. So only certain things are relevant to that problem. And then some things are maybe have an impact, but the impact's not large enough to worry about, or there are other ways of dealing with it. So it's okay to simplify climate models, and that's what they do, because you can't have everything in the computer, basically.
So everything is not everything. We have conclusively proven today. Okay,
Yes.
so our next clip then is about Jordan Peterson discussing coastal management. Now, although we have kind of ripped into him a little bit here about his lack of expertise, he does claim in this section, prior to the clip that we've recorded, he does claim to be a lot more of an expert on this because he's read hundreds of books apparently on the topic. Hundreds. So he had a role involved in a kind of advisory role in the Canadian government on sustainability, and this is him talking about the problems of coastal management.
Because I did realize that one thing we're doing that's extraordinarily stupid on the ecological front is destroying all the marine life within 40 miles of the shores. And all the marine life is within 40 miles of the shores. Like, you think the oceans, they're vast. It's like,
Right.
yeah, but they're empty.
Yeah.
Except for where the sun can shine to the bottom. And that's the 40 to 200 miles, say, on the coastal shelves. And we've, like, trawled those bare like 7 times.
Isn't that
It's
wild?
a catastrophe. So, but that was the only real environmental catastrophe that I encountered in all that work that I thought was both credible and addressable. We know how to fix that. You make marine protected areas like national parks that you need about 15% of the total coastal territory really protected. And that solves that problem essentially. And then everybody has fish because the fish, they don't just stay there, they move around. You can have your cake and eat it too with marine protected areas.
Okay, so he does care about the environment. I care because
Yes.
this one issue is solvable and we can do something about it and matters. Everything else is bollocks.
That's basically kind of what he's saying, I guess. I mean, like it was actually a little bit refreshing, this section, to be honest, because he says some things which are correct. Yeah, I mean, the way we treat the ocean is, and the sort of fishing, fisheries, and whatnot, and trawling, it's all true, and we are abusing it basically, and we should probably take a good, long, hard look at ourselves. I don't know. He's kind of using it to say that look, listen. Don't get me wrong. I'm not like anti the environment per se. I just think I've looked at the evidence and there is no other problem here apart from this one problem. So this sort of gives him a sort of like, I guess he's sort of saying this to give as evidence that he's not uncaring. He does care about an environmental problem.
And that he does have some expertise in this as well.
Yeah, he's obviously read something, and it's obviously been okay. I mean, like was he's a bit hyperbolic. Like, what was he like? We've trawled all the coastal shelves completely bare 7 times, and it's like, yeah, that's obviously a bit of a hyperbolic statement, because if you trawled them bare, then you wouldn't trawl them again, presumably. But yeah, and also, what was he saying? That it's the only environmental problem that is credible and addressable. So it sort of made me wonder whether if we had, in his mind, an environmental problem that was credible but wasn't addressable, then we could ignore it, because it's not both of those things. Which just seemed a bit weird,
or not credible but addressable.
Well, that would be a bit of an odd problem
that doesn't need solving. Yeah. So, like, can you pin him down on other specific things that he's not mentioned here? Then, when he's saying that trawling the coasts bare is the only problem, what other very directly, obviously quantifiable problems are there?
Yeah, that's a good point. Thank you for reminding me of that, because I even, just before we came on, I actually looked up, there's this pie chart which is kind of really good, and it basically summarizes in one diagram all the different problems, environmental problems that we have, and it also shows you of them. There's about 8 or 9 on the graph, and I'll read them out in a second, but it also tells you like how dangerous is the current situation with regard to them. So, for example, if you look at stratospheric ozone depletion, there is a bit of a problem there at the moment, but we're still under the limit, under sort of the safe space in the green zone. But then you have, so if we talk about the biggest problems first, according to this graph, you have biodiversity loss is just off the charts, which I think we all know about. So, like, I think it's quite commonly accepted that we're in a mass extinction event that we're causing. And also, I can't say I understand this one very well, but there's a problem with the nitrogen cycle and it's probably related to our use and abuse of fertilizer, I would imagine.
What, deliberately
but that's also,
taking nitrogen from the atmosphere and putting it into the soil, and then that causing an imbalance, is it? Or
yes, this is where I'm a bit hazy, to be honest. I should really know this, but there's certainly problems with fertilizer going into rivers and then damaging rivers. But that I don't know whether that's what they're referring to. But okay, so then you have climate change, which is above the sort of the safe operating space. You have ocean acidification, which is sort of separate. It's about the oceans becoming
and so
more
that
acidic.
Destroys coral life, and I presume fish can't survive in more acidic water.
Yeah, I'm not. So certainly the corals are sort of like the sort of the biodiversity hub for a lot of the marine ecosystems. So if the corals go, then a lot of the sort of the food web goes, as it were. But also like little individual creatures have like shells made of calcium carbonate, and these shells will dissolve in ocean. In an acidifying ocean. We've got global freshwater use. We're busy sort of like pulling out sort of supplies of like fresh water from underneath the ground at an unsustainable rate. We have changes in land use. We have atmospheric aerosol loading. We have chemical pollution. Have I mentioned all of them? There's also problems with the phosphorus cycle. This is probably also to do with fertilizer. So there's I'll put this in the show notes, this graph, but you can sort of see that there's a myriad of environmental problems. Some are more serious than others. They're all not looking great, to be honest. But the idea that the ocean is the only thing that's got a problem, I think there was so much to mention in not the last section you played out from Peterson, but the one before that. But I didn't even get round to saying it. I made about 4 points, and you prompted me to make another 2.
Oh, well,
I still haven't made
go ahead.
all of them.
What else could we say?
So you could hear that there was a sort of like a level 2 of the ziggurat. Like the climate may be warming, but humans are not responsible. There was that kind of vibe in it. I can't now specifically remember what he said, but no, this is what he said. So he said, like, because there's so much error in the in the forecasts for 100 years' time, we wouldn't know if changes that we make today would actually have caused any impact, even if we waited 80 years, because there'd be so much, error on it. And like in this, I just thought, look, we have it fairly well down from like hundreds of years of science about the relationship between greenhouse gases and sort of global warming. It's something we've already got down. So we don't even need to wait for like years into the future to know what we're doing now is correct. If we stop pumping carbon dioxide into the atmosphere now, it is pretty certain that the climate will cool again, or stop getting warmer. Like, we already understand that it's based on, on sort of the physics that we know, the thermal physics of these gases.
Yeah, it's almost this kind of way of just saying, so we just don't need to do anything. It's too big a problem,
exactly.
And it's like, so much unknown, so we just should just carry on as we are, just making things worse.
Yeah, we don't know is what he's sort of saying. We don't know, so we can't do anything. Sorry, I'm getting a bit heated with as time goes on.
This is what pisses me off ultimately about this kind of argument, because so often when the shoe is on the other foot, like people like us are accused of not coming up with solutions, not being solution focused, being too worried about the problems rather than what you're going to do about it, not being pragmatic. And this is an example of like somebody who claims to not be right-wing but really is quite right-wing actually just refusing to do something that we can do something about because it's hard and because it's a big problem. And actually, I think one of the greatest things about humanity is that when we put our mind to it, we can overcome huge problems that are very difficult when we decide to do something about it.
Yes. Yeah, I don't really see anything proactive. I mean, he doesn't believe the problem is real, so he's not going to come up with any problems. But yeah, anyway.
Was there anything else that you wanted to say on that previous clip at all, Mark?
I think I maxed it out. Yeah. No, I was just going to say, Rogan Sorry, this is we're doing this in the wrong order, but the very beginning of that, because there was just so much he said that needed addressing. But at the very beginning, Rogan sort of comes in and sort of basically explains what climate is. So he's having Joe Rogan, who is not a climate expert, sort of try and clarify the subject matter for it. I just thought that was nice. Rogan does a sort of he's not an expert, obviously, but he does a fairly okay job at holding Jordan Peterson to the fire on occasion. Yeah. So yeah. So there is a little bit of pushback.
Absolutely.
It's not like a free.
There is a little bit more of that with some of the later clips that we're going to look at as well. And also on the climate modelling errors, some of the analogies that he goes on to talk about are just batshit, absolutely mad. Go and listen to the original episode if you want. It was too long-winded and convoluted a clip for me to actually be able to edit into anything that made any sense. But he starts going on about an analogy between ants and grasshoppers, and it is just a long chain of nonsense, half-baked, half-thought-through analogies that don't actually link up. It sounds really clever, but when you stop and unpick them all, it doesn't make a cogent argument. Right.
I think I remember that.
Okay, so our next clip. So making the poor rich will solve the environmental problems. Okay, here we go.
But mostly what I learned, and this was really cool, was that this was so cool, and I really believe it's true. The fastest way to make the planet sustainably green and ecologically viable is to make poor people as rich as possible, as fast as we possibly can.
Okay, so here he's put in the first stumbling block for people. The idea that if you argue against this argument, that it's a good thing to make the poor richer, well then you just come across like a bastard, don't you? No, of course we shouldn't make the poor richer.
Yes.
It'd be a disaster.
I mean, yeah. I mean, he's. Yeah, sorry. I thought that quote was going to be.
We
a bit
do have
longer.
A second half of it.
Maybe
we do come back to in a bit.
Okay. Yeah. No, I mean, so basically, I agree with you there. It sort of feels like a trap, doesn't it? But rest assured that you and I, John, we don't want to. We want the poor to become richer.
So I think you've mentioned to me previously that in some sense it is true. In that the idea that generally when people do become better off, then they have fewer children, which then could help in the short term.
Yeah.
And also that coal is currently necessary for the poor, that if we kind of move to people being wealthier, that we then would potentially be able to move away from a reliance on coal. Is that potentially an angle there?
So I think that's what he's getting at. So you get richer, you have fewer children, and then so I guess at a very simplistic level, fewer people means less environmental destruction generally. But you've also got the, I mean, so for example, if you take a look at the developing world now, where there are lots of people, when you look at the overall footprint of somewhere, I don't know, like Bangladesh, it is far. This is from a climate perspective, obviously, not necessarily other environmental problems, but you've got just a much, compared to somewhere like America, for example, the amount of emissions per person is far lower. And then if you go to, I don't know, so one of the richest countries in the world, Sweden, are people there necessarily paragons of environmental virtue? It's not necessarily the case. So I think he's not wrong in a certain sort of way, but also it's not quite as simple as that, And so I think basically he's like, stop all this activism, stop doing anything else apart from economic development. But economic development on its own is not going to be a magic bullet, in his very simplistic understanding.
It's just common knowledge, isn't it? That the top 1% of carbon emission, top 1% of wealthy people are responsible for the vast majority of carbon emissions, and that it's the inverse of that that actually it's the very, very wealthy that are the biggest cause of carbon emissions, and that like uplifting the poor, like obviously it's not going to dramatically make things worse, but it's certainly not going to solve the problem. It's just going to be adding more into the system. And like the argument that he also makes and goes on to make in a very long-winded way is the idea that when you are on the breadline and when you are living a subsistence lifestyle, you don't care about the bigger issues. You don't care about the environment because you're more focused on meeting your Maslow's needs of like getting food, getting water, getting basic sustenance. And like the idea that he says, the point that he makes that you, as you get wealthier, you then are able to care about these issues, so you do, is an example of a false equivalence and a massive assumption, because it's quite obvious that just because you are wealthy doesn't mean that you automatically give a shit about the environment. If anything, we're very much seeing the opposite in a lot of ways. And the idea that you being poor, therefore you don't care about the environment, is also really patronizing, and also shows a real like kind of Western centralized view of the world. Because say for example, if you're somebody that lives in like island nations out in the Pacific, you don't have to be wealthy to be giving a shit about climate change, because climate change is already an existential crisis for your country. But climate change matters to the poor just as much, if not more, than it matters to the rich.
Yeah, I mean, certainly, irrespective of whether the poor of the world are, have climate change first and foremost on their minds. Like climate change is going to be a huge problem for the developing world in the future. So, we need to sort this problem out so that. Sorry, maybe I'm mixing up things, but yeah, in any case, like I think we need to help the poor sort of jump over using things like coal, leapfrog these technologies. So I think that should be on us. Yeah, certainly.
Absolutely. Yeah, if countries can move straight to sustainable energy methods, like in the first instance, that's just going to be such a game changer for the future of the planet. Okay, so our next one is about capitalism has not caused environmental problems. It's the other way round.
If the politicians who were discussing environmental sustainability were serious, especially the left-wing ones, and I say especially because the left-wing ones always say, well, we care about the poor and dispossessed. It's like, do you really? When push comes to shove. It's like, is it the environment or poor people? If your idea is that we have to limit growth to save the planet. If we limit growth, poor people starve. Because whenever we put limits on economic development, who suffers? The rich? Are you really? That's what you think? And you're on the left, you think if you put limits on economic development, the rich will suffer. That runs contrary to every theory that your whole political philosophy is based on. You put limits to growth on, the poor stay poor or get worse. Doesn't matter because the planet has too many people on it anyways, which it most certainly does not. If you are serious about the environment and even vaguely concerned about poor people, all of your policies would be devoted to making the poor rich as fast as possible. But that would violate the anti-capitalist presumption, let's say, that the reason for environmental degradation in the first place is, say, entrepreneurial and free market development, which it most certainly isn't. That's actually completely backwards. Make poor people rich. So what should a COP26 been about? That's fairly straightforward. It should have been about trying to generate as much energy as we possibly can to be distributed as widely as possible in the cheapest possible manner.
Okay, so a bit of a longer one there and quite a lot to unpick. So what are you thinking on that, Mark?
Yeah, so initially he's he's trying to sort of say that left-wingers seem to be sort of sacrificing the poor, to help the environment. And I think several things that we've said in the previous segment, that isn't really an accurate characterization for the most part. I guess there are some sort of anti-capitalists who have sort of an idea that we can we can sort of growth is part of the problem that's causing climate change and environmental problems more generally. And there is a kind of like it is kind of true, but equally, if you sort of say like we can't have any more growth, then the whole sort of economic system that the world is based on, might grind to a halt if we were theoretically able to stop it, and that probably would have a lot of deleterious effects for everyone, but especially the poor people. So I think he's got a point there. It might be a bit idealistic to sort of think that we need to stop growth, which some environmentalists and left-wing people do think. I just think personally that you've got to make the growth greener somehow. So stop using fossil fuels, for example, get on renewables.
It's just a reevaluation of what you're investing in. It's not anti-investment. It's just changing now that we know that what we're investing in is damaging. Let's invest in some things that are not, and that are, because let's be honest, the concept of something being sustainable, how is that not a good thing? Like the idea of something being able to keep going surely is a good economic model. Surely a bad economic model is running out, because that's going to grind things to a halt far quicker.
Yeah, I totally agree there. He advocates we need to get as much at COP26. We need to get as much energy to the poor as possible. And it's like, surely it matters how you produce that energy. And again, we're not saying the poor should go without energy, but people like me, for example, would think that we need to help them. Because they're not as rich as us, we need to help them get their energy from sources
and by
other than
rich
fossil
as well,
fuels.
we also mean it's an infrastructure thing as well. The countries that are struggling to develop, they do not have the systems in place in order to benefit from these new technologies yet. Yeah,
that's true.
Absolutely. Yeah. Okay, shall we move on to the next clip then? Okay, so next one. This is a great non sequitur, this one, okay? The dangers of solar energy.
Yeah, we still have a weird idea of nuclear because of the several, whether it's 3 Mile Island, Chernobyl, there's been a few disasters.
Yeah, more people
Fukushima.
die every year from solar energy than die from nuclear.
Who dies from solar? Well, of course.
Guess how you die from solar?
Sunburn?
No, you fall off the roofs when you're installing it.
Oh.
Yeah,
that's gravity.
Right. Yeah, gravity. Yeah. And, that's a good example of unintended consequences. Because systems are complex, and when you change them, you think only good things will happen. It's like, well...
Fuck me. Like, what is this argument all about? Like, how can you take anyone seriously who argues that we shouldn't use solar panels because some people have fallen off the roof from installing them? Like, that's like, it's just a bullshit non sequitur. Like, how many people die on gas stations from exploding gas, or die on oil plantations, or who have driven their truck containing oil somewhere? Like, it's just an absolute ridiculous statistic to throw out there, and like, say for example, when people like are when people die in a car accident, if they were driving to go on holiday, you don't say, it was holidays that killed them. If only people went on less holidays, there would be less car crashes. It's just absolute bollocks.
Yeah, like I think the thing that he conspicuously misses out here is like, if you... I actually went and looked up, sort of how many people die from falling off roofs or something like that. I can't remember, but what was interesting is if you look at the deaths from different like forms of energy, you have at the bottom you've got sort of nuclear and solar with almost none, but of course they stick in our minds because of things like Chernobyl and whatnot. But then you look at like coal, oil, and gas, and it just like blows them out of the water. So why are we here talking about like sort of people falling off roofs when like every year people have reduced life expectancy and dying prematurely because of inhaling particulates from coal. It's enormous.
It's such a cherry picking of facts in order to like spin this whole kind of constructed argument that he's made, rather than actually looking at all the evidence and going, there's your biggest problem.
Yeah, exactly.
Okay, so next up we have him talking about particle pollution and the impact of particle pollution on children.
Yeah.
So the poorest people burn wood. Well, that's not so good because, first of all, they cut down the trees and burn the trees. And second, if you're concerned about pollution, especially particulate pollution, especially indoors, which kills, I think, 7 million children a year. 7 million children a year are killed by indoor particulate pollution.
What?
Yeah.
How is that possible?
Okay, so this is one that actually is another example of Joe Rogan really going to town to him, and something we didn't mention in the last one about Joe Rogan making the very good point of going, no, they're not dying from solar, they're dying from gravity. And this is another one where he goes away and fact checks him on this. So have you got anything to add about the indoor particle pollution here, Mark?
I mean, first of all, we've got two different problems. We've got climate change, and then we've got sort of the indoor health problems from burning sort of wood, and everyone thinks that that basically the poor of the world need to get electricity so that they can avoid this problem, because it's a serious health problem. So but I mean, I guess he starts sort of saying sort of coal is better than wood, but it sort of, you see, it jumps when you go to sort of fossil fuels, because fossil fuels typically get generated in a power station, so you don't need to have them in the home. So of course, going to coal, having the country run on coal is better for your indoor air pollution problem, but obviously it's very bad from a climate perspective. And so it's so on the one hand you can be for getting sort of wood burning out of individual houses. But you can be against coal. They're not sort of mutually exclusive positions, but he seems to be implying that they are, But again, it's a conceptual lack of clarity, because he's sort of thinking environmental problem, air pollution in the house, carbon dioxide in the atmosphere. It's just,
the argument that just by burning your coal outdoors, that's going to reduce your indoor particle pollution. Of course it will, but it's not actually going to reduce pollution. Okay, so next up, he is talking about fracking and the benefits of fracking.
And so you want to burn wood. Well, charcoal's better. Coal's better than that in terms of pollution as well. And then fossil fuels are better than coal. And then natural gas is perhaps the cleanest of the fossil fuels. And maybe, I don't know if you know this, but this is so funny too. The United States has cut its carbon emissions 15% in the last 20 years. It's gone down, not up, down. Why? Fracking.
Fracking.
Yeah, fracking.
Really?
This thing that environmentalists hate. It's like, don't frack.
It's a double-edged sword, right? Because fracking has definitely polluted some water supplies.
Not really.
Sounds awfully confident there.
Okay. So fracking has reduced pollution, and it doesn't have environmental effects on rivers. Those are the claims he makes there. What do you think, Mark?
Well, I mean, to be honest, I don't know that much about fracking and its environmental pollution. I presume it does cause some sort of pollution of underground water. I mean, it's probably true that as sort of more and more coal mines shut down in the US and they move towards sort of fracking and natural gas, it probably has a lower emission associated with it. So it's possibly true that the US has managed to shave off 15% of its emissions via going to fracking. I mean, that doesn't mean fracking can have lots of other problems associated with it. But also, in general, sometimes people talk about natural gas as a transition fuel. So ultimately we've got to get away from it as well. But it's better than coal. But the problem is, I think, when people sort of tend to sort of go for natural gas and then sort of stay there, and have no plans to continue decarbonising. So, I mean, great that the US has cut its emissions by 15%. It needs to do a lot more. It's not going to be able to, if it wants to be part of the effort to sort of deal with climate change, that's not enough, even though it's something.
Okay, so our next clip then about reducing carbon emissions.
I still want to, like, we've kind of, like, you went on these rants, so I want to, like, bring you back to, like, this idea of climate and environment. We should be concerned not just about particulate pollution, but shouldn't we be concerned about the effect that we're having on the CO2 that we release in the atmosphere? Now, from what I've read, it has an impact. They don't exactly know what percentage of an impact it has, but it's most certainly something that we can reduce. What I also read...
That's not so certain.
Okay, so this is one that really lies at the heart of what we look at, doesn't it? You know, Joe Rogan pointing out his waffling and saying, but let's pin you down on actual CO2 going into the atmosphere. It is happening, and it is something we can do something about. And Jordan Peterson says, no, we can't.
Yeah, I mean, like, Joe Rogan starts off well, and then he sort of said, well, we're not kind of really sure how much of an impact. It's like, yes, we do know how much of an impact. We've got that pretty well turned down. So even in Joe Rogan's statement, there's a sort of there's a bit of climate denial. You know, like the type 2. It's. I mean, he's sort of saying we are a little bit to blame, but maybe we're not totally to blame. You know, kind of that's the sort of where he is. And then Jordan Peterson comes in and says, no, we're not sure about that. So he's saying even your skeptical position, it's not skeptical enough. You know, so I guess he's trying to argue that there is no impact, or something like that. So yeah, this comes back to good old-fashioned level 1, level 2 climate denial. You know, the sort of absolute denial of science. And if you had read 200 books, Jordan Peterson, as you claim to, you wouldn't be confused about this.
So we just need to direct him to listen to our earlier episodes, don't we? Yeah, go and listen to those. Yeah.
I'm sure he'll listen. I'm sure he'll listen, as he's got a very open mind. You know, he could be wrong. He knows that. You know.
Okay, and I think we might well be on to our last clip here. So let's give this a spin.
I've been very curious about why the left-wing types, particularly, seem willing to sacrifice the poor to their utopian...
I don't think they're thinking that way. I just don't think they played it all out.
When push comes to shove, that's what they do. And it wouldn't take much thought to figure it out, because let's say you increase the cost of energy, and that's the price you pay to move forward to a hypothetically green economy. But you increase the price of energy. Mm-hmm. Okay, so what happens is that in any system that's hierarchical, and this is the left-wingers know this because it drives their whole philosophy, in any hierarchical system, when you stress the system, the disproportionate amount of that stress falls on the people who are in the lower rungs, because they're barely hanging on anyways. So, you know, you get a 1% increase in unemployment. You get a 5% increase in psychiatric hospitalizations. Well, why? It's because there's a bunch of people there who are right on the threshold of psychiatric hospitalization, and then they lose their job.
Okay, so the fundamentals of what he's talking about here, I think, are relatively true. The idea that, you know, if you stress any kind of system, that is going to disproportionately affect those that are right on the threshold of being able to sustain. You know, we're seeing that even in the UK with the cost of living crisis at the moment. Those people right on the breadline suffer the most. But his argument that a move towards a greener system will be more expensive, and also moving to a green system is going to stress the system. How much truth is there in those claims then?
Right. So I guess there is a little bit of truth. So it's really annoying in a certain sort of way, because, you know, if we'd started earlier with transitioning away from fossil fuels, it would have been a lot cheaper. You know, so there is going to, you know, like for example, just in the UK, you know, like we need to. Ultimately, people need to use sort of electric vehicles, and these need to be plugged into the grid. So there is an awful lot of infrastructure. I think in the UK, Labour had, up until a few days ago, a 28 billion green spending package, which they ditched.
I'm really putting my vote at risk, I'm not going to lie. And, you know, like, it's also been this week in the news in the UK come out about the House of Lords wanting to take action, says the government needs to take action against misinformation going out through the press about electric vehicles as well. I think you shared an article with me on that as well.
Yeah, certainly this is important, what you've just been saying. The thing with climate change is, so, okay, if you bugger it up and if you say, okay, we need to transition to a green economy, but all the costs are going to be borne by the poorest. you're gonna just get resentment. You're gonna get populism. It's not going to work. Okay, so if you need to have some sort of fair way of society burdening the cost, and perhaps maybe some of the polluters.
How ironic!
Pay.
How ironic!
Some of the people who are making lots of
but if we change this system, it's going to be the poor that are going to bear the brunt of this, and it's like, but it's the richest that are causing it. So maybe that's something that needs addressing. It's all about accountability, in my opinion, really.
Yes, but also even with Jordan Peterson's argument, again, he doesn't think this is a real problem, but it is, and it's going to get, if we don't do anything about it, it's just going to, the costs are just going to go up and up and up. So we're not going to be, we're not spared with some hypothetical future where we don't have to pay these increased costs. Someone is going to pay. And if we delay, then we're going to have to pay more. But there is a cost, and this cost needs to be carefully thought about how it's burdened, because otherwise we're not going to successfully transition to a green future if we bugger it up.
Yeah,
and we're stupid about it.
Okay, well, I think that's it. I think we've pretty comprehensively gone through and unpicked the major points that he makes there. There is more in the clip, so if you are interested, go and give it the original version a listen, even if it's just a check to make sure that we haven't cherry picked or altered his words or what he's saying at all. So what are your overall thoughts then on Jordan Peterson then, Mark?
Right, so I find him an interesting case because he is obviously quite confused about the subject matter he's discussing. For example, the distinction between climate activism and climate science, he doesn't appear to have much of an idea about. Weather and climate, he muddles up all the time. So that's just a couple of examples. And because he's so hopelessly confused, I kind of weirdly see him as a victim of climate disinformation, more so than a denier or contrarian. But that being said, victim or not, he's promoting denial and misinformation in front of an enormous audience. I mean, Joe Rogan's podcast has 200 million downloads a month. That's astounding. And that is a lot of damage for people like you and I, John, to slowly No, we're not. Not by a long shot. But we try, John, we try. A few podcasts ago, we talked about why there is so much climate denial out there. And one of the three categories we came up with was a sort of a social psychological angle, the culture war. And Jordan, if you look through his 100 plus tweets per day on Twitter, you can see that he's eyeball deep in the culture war. Therefore, for him, he's basically anything that's anti the left, he's against. And so that's why he sort of turns towards stuff that is quite climate denial-y. Apart from that, there's a few moments in the interview where you get the sense that he just sort of can't believe that such a large problem could possibly exist. Maybe he could benefit from seeing that image we sometimes show where you have the solid earth and then you have the atmosphere wrapped up into a marble, and the ocean as well wrapped up into a marble, and you sort of can see the relative sizes. But in any case, I don't think he'd be interested in learning, because gurus like Peterson tell others what to think. They don't have plebs like self-proclaimed gurus, yeah. But they tell others what to think. They don't have plebs like us telling them what to think, basically. Or, people who know something about a subject. If you're interested in examining Jordan from the point of view of a guru, you do worse than check out the episode of a podcast called Decoding the Gurus, and I'll put a link in the show notes. They argue that one of the qualities of a guru is a characteristic called galaxy brainness or polymathness, the ability to have expertise in multiple domains simultaneously. And this is, you pointed this out again and again, John, about Jordan Peterson. Now maybe out there polymaths exist, and I'm not going to comment on that, but what I do know is that the world is awash with self-proclaimed polymaths, and the result is what you get here. Jordan speaks with absolute confidence on a subject on which he hasn't understood the basics, particularly when it comes to basic climate science. But he can seemingly get away with this because knowledge of climate science must be low in the audience. Or maybe his audience is here for the culture war hot takes than for knowledge per se. And although Joe Rogan pushes back a little bit from time to time, doesn't do quite the job that you might have hoped in holding his feet to the fire, because obviously he's not an expert either. Yeah. So those are my thoughts. Do you have anything to add to that, John?
I was at some points when I was kind of listening to the episode, I was thinking, here we've got a podcast, two white guys that are criticising things that they don't actually know a whole lot about. And I do appreciate the irony of us being two white guys criticising two white guys, and one of us at least on the podcast who doesn't know a whole lot about climate science, but we do at least have yourself who's the real expert on this. So, I'm hoping that we have at least done something towards combating some of the untruths or the errors or the misconceptions that are addressed here.
It's been a while since the podcast got released, so it might be old news and everyone's moved on and no one gives a shit anymore. But it was nice to sort of actually engage with some content.
I had quite a lot of fun picking this apart. It's been quite fun. Maybe we should do something similar in future. Let us know if people like the episode, and if you want more of it, or if you've got other climate deniers that you would like us to combat in an episode, and we'll see what we can do. Right, shall we move on to a good news story then, Mark? Okay,
yes,
so
please.
This is a good news story about green energy, and this is a recent study that has concluded that tripling green energy by 2030 is achievable. So this is following on from 2023. It's been really widespread in the news that it was the hottest year on record. And a report from the International Energy Agency, the IEA, has said that there's been a record-breaking rollout of renewables in 2023 that puts us in with a real chance of tripling energy capacity by the end of the decade, which was a key target agreed at the COP28 climate summit. So the largest growth across the whole world took place in China, which commissioned as much solar energy in 2023 as the entire world did in 2022. Their wind power additions have also risen by 66% year on year, and the country's carbon emissions are predicted to peak this year. Also in the UK, heat pump installations have reached a record high. So it seems like some of the biggest countries, are really at tipping points when it comes to energy emissions, which is a real positive. So it said that currently, under current policies and market conditions, global renewable capacity is on course to increase by 2.5 times. But that's not yet enough to reach our goal of reaching triple renewables. But that is something that we can do, that countries are demonstrating that it can be done. The governments have got the tools to close the gap. They've just got to have the willpower and the policies to see that through. He said that onshore, so this is the executive director of IEA, said that onshore wind and solar PV are cheaper today than new fossil fuel plants almost everywhere, and cheaper than existing fossil fuel plants in most countries. And we have got the added factor that trying to drill for oil in the North Sea, and in reclaimed land from Arctic ice melting, those are really hostile environments to try and get oil and gas from. So they are going to be expensive to drill for. Whereas if we're seeing wind and solar becoming cheaper, then that's really a lot more viable an option. But he does conclude by saying increasing renewable capacity alone is not enough, because it also needs to go alongside with the reduction of burning fossil fuels. Otherwise, we're just keeping the problem going.
Yeah, certainly. That's good. I just hope that the UK government isn't giving subsidies to fossil fuel companies to go and drill in these difficult to drill places.
Okay, so I think we're done for today then. So thank you very much for listening. You can find a link to all of the materials we've referenced in our show notes. The next level of the ziggurat we'll be looking at is level 5. If the positive impacts don't outweigh the negatives, technology should be able to solve problems as they arise. Over the next few weeks, we're not sure what our pattern for episode releasing is going to be. If you're not aware, Mark is doing a PhD at the moment, and his PhD is coming to a head. Only how much longer have you got left on it, Mark?
So end of March.
About 6 more weeks to complete. How many years have you been doing your PhD, Mark?
Too long. I don't care to admit.
So
a long time.
That might affect our release schedule because it takes a lot of planning and prep for the episodes. But we hope you'll keep an eye and join us for them. We'll let you know when the episode's been released. If you want to know more about the Countering Climate Skepticism podcast, check out our website at ccspod.podbean.com. If you've enjoyed the episode and would like to support the show further, you can leave us a review on iTunes or Apple Podcasts, as it's known now. Spotify, giving us 5-star reviews really helps us as well. If you want to send us any feedback, suggestions for episodes, or if you've got questions or topics you want us to ask or discuss on the show, then get in touch with us on social media. This is goodbye from me, John Rainier.
Goodbye from me, Mark Prosser.
A Native American proverb: we do not inherit the earth from our ancestors, we borrow it from our children. Goodbye.